A black man in civilian clothes pulls up to a military base gate on a cold November morning, his rental car idling as two young white guards step forward with flashlights still on, even though the sun is rising behind them. And before he can even roll down his window completely, one guard is already shaking his head saying, "Wrong entrance, buddy." Deliveries are around back, his hand resting on his belt like he's ready for trouble. And the man in the car, let's call him Marcus, takes a slow breath because he's been here before. Not at this gate, but in moments like this. Moments where his face tells a different story than his credentials, and he calmly says, "I'm here for duty. I need to check in at the main building." But the guard, younger, maybe 23 with a fresh haircut and a smirk that says he's never been questioned, he laughs, actually laughs, and turns to his partner saying, "Another one thinks he can just roll up." And Marcus feels that familiar burn in his chest. That mix of anger and exhaustion because he's a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy with 17 years of service, 2 tours overseas, commendations lining his office wall back home. But right now, in this moment, he's just another black man being told he doesn't belong. The second guard, older, maybe 40, steps closer and taps on the window harder than necessary, saying ID and registration and make it quick. We don't have time for games. And Marcus reaches slowly for his wallet. Movement's deliberate because he knows how this can go wrong, how a reach can become a threat in someone else's narrative. And he hands over his military ID, the one with his rank clearly visible, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes, and watches as the young guard barely glances at it before saying, "This doesn't look right. When did you get this yesterday?" And there it is, the accusation without evidence. The assumption of fraud, because how could this man in a 10-year-old Honda with coffee stains on the passenger seat possibly be an officer? And Marcus says quietly, voice steady but firm, "That ID is current. Issued 3 months ago, and I'm expected at 800 for a command briefing, but the young guard is already calling it in." Radio crackling as he reports a suspicious individual claiming to be military personnel, possible stolen ID. And Marcus knows this is about to get worse before it gets better. Can you imagine sitting there, knowing you've given everything to your country, missed birthdays and anniversaries, and your daughter's first steps because you were protecting the very freedoms these guards are supposed to uphold? And now you're being treated like a criminal at the gate of your own base? The older guard tells Marcus to turn off the engine and step out of the vehicle. Hands visible, and there's a small crowd forming now. Other personnel arriving for morning shift, some in uniform, some not, all watching as this scene unfolds. And Marcus complies because what choice does he have? He steps out slowly, hands raised slightly, and the young guard actually reaches for his weapon. Not drawing it, but touching it, a gesture meant to intimidate, meant to remind Marcus of who has power in this moment. And someone in the growing crowd, a white woman in civilian clothes, she whispers to her companion, "What did he do?" As if his blackness alone is evidence of wrongdoing, the guards make Marcus stand against his car while they search it, roughly opening doors and the trunk, pulling out his overnight bag, unzipping it right there on the pavement, his clothes and toiletries scattered like he's a suspect in a crime he didn't commit. And the young guard holds up Marcus's dress uniform, still in dry cleaning plastic, and says, "Where'd you steal this from?" And that's when Marcus feels something shift inside him. Not anger now, but something colder, a decision forming. Because he realizes these guards don't just doubt his credentials. They fundamentally cannot accept that he might be who he says he is. And he thinks about all the young black sailors and soldiers who might face this same treatment, who might not have his rank or his years of experience to fall back on, who might internalize this humiliation as truth. But here's what the guards don't know. What they couldn't possibly know because they were too busy performing their prejudice for each other. Marcus Hayes isn't just any lieutenant commander. He's the incoming deputy base commander for this entire installation. He's about to become the second highest ranking officer on this base, and his first official act was supposed to be a quiet arrival, a low-key check-in before his formal introduction ceremony scheduled for this afternoon. But instead, he's being detained at the gate by 2 men who will soon be under his command. And the irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. A senior officer, a white colonel in full uniform, pulls up behind Marcus's car, annoyed at the delay, And he gets out asking what the holdup is, and the young guard, still so confident in his righteousness, explains they've detained someone with a suspicious ID claiming to be an officer. And the colonel, let's call him Patterson, he walks over expecting to see maybe some kid with a fake ID trying to impress a date. But instead, he sees Marcus standing there, hands still partially raised. And Patterson's face goes completely white because he recognizes Marcus immediately. They served together 6 years ago in Bahrain. And Patterson says quietly, almost whispering, "Marcus?" And the young guard interrupts, saying, "Sir, we've got this under control." And Patterson turns to him, voice suddenly sharp as a blade, saying, "Under control? Do you have any idea who this man is?" And you can see the confidence start to crack in the young guard's face, just a little. Just enough. But the damage is done. The humiliation is complete. Marcus has been standing here for 20 minutes now, his belongings scattered across the pavement. A dozen witnesses watching, some recording on their phones, and Patterson is trying to smooth it over, saying something about procedures and misunderstandings. But Marcus just looks at him and says, "There's no misunderstanding here, Colonel. These guards saw exactly what they wanted to see." And that sentence hangs in the air like smoke. Heavy and undeniable because everyone within earshot knows exactly what he means. They all understand the subtext, the unspoken truth that no amount of medals or rank can fully protect you from the assumptions people make about your skin. The young guard, his name tag reads Whitmore. He's starting to realize something is very wrong. Watching Patterson's body language, the way the colonel has stepped back from Marcus like he's addressing a superior. And Whitmore stammers, "Sir, we were just following protocol." He didn't have base access authorization visible, grasping for any justification, any thread that might save him from what's coming, and Marcus finally speaks directly to him, voice calm but carrying an edge that makes everyone go quiet. What protocol requires you to assume a military ID is fake? What protocol tells you to search a vehicle without probable cause? What protocol lets you humiliate an officer in front of his future command? And with each question, Whitmore shrinks a little more. And the older guard, his name is Jensen, he's already backing away, literally taking steps backward like he can distance himself from this disaster. But it's too late. They're both in it now. They made their choice when they decided Marcus didn't look like he belonged. Patterson is on his radio now. You can hear the urgency in his voice, calling for the base commander, calling for the security chief, using phrases like incident at main gate and immediate supervisor required. And Marcus is calmly repacking his belongings, folding his uniform with precise military corners despite his hands shaking slightly. And that's when you understand the true cost of this encounter. Not just the public humiliation, but the private toll. The way a man who's given 17 years of his life to service has to stand there and prove his humanity to people who should be saluting him. What happens next is almost painful to watch, in that satisfying way justice sometimes is, because within 10 minutes the main gate area is crowded with brass, the base commander himself. Rear Admiral Catherine Morrison arrives in her staff car, and she's a white woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and a reputation for running the tightest ship in the Pacific Fleet. And when she sees Marcus still standing by his car with Patterson trying to explain, she doesn't ask questions first. She walks directly to Marcus, stands at attention and salutes him crisply, saying, "Lieutenant Commander Hayes, on behalf of this installation, I apologize for this completely unacceptable treatment," and her voice carries across the gate area, deliberate and clear, making sure everyone understands exactly who Marcus is. And Whitmore looks like he might pass out, his face going from red to pale in seconds, and Jensen has actually removed his cap, holding it in both hands like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. Admiral Morrison turns to the two guards, and her expression could freeze fire. She doesn't raise her voice, but somehow it gets quieter and more terrifying, saying, "Explain to me why an incoming deputy base commander was detained, searched, and humiliated at my gate." And the question isn't really a question, it's a sentencing, and Whitmore tries to speak, mouth opening and closing, but nothing comes out that makes sense. Just fragments about procedures and verification and couldn't be sure, and Morrison cuts him off. Couldn't be sure of what exactly? His ID was valid, his rank was visible. What exactly made you doubt his credentials? And the silence that follows is deafening because everyone knows the answer, but no one wants to say it out loud. Not even Whitmore, who's realizing that saying he didn't look like an officer would be admitting exactly what this was about. Marcus watches all this unfold with a strange mix of emotions. Vindication, yes, but also bone-deep weariness, because this isn't his first time, won't be his last time. And he thinks about his daughter, 13 years old. Smart as a whip and already asking questions about why people look at Daddy different sometimes. And what is he supposed to tell her now that even after you've climbed to the top, even after you've earned every stripe and commendation, there will still be people who see your skin before they see your service? Admiral Morrison is ordering an immediate investigation, suspensions pending review, mandatory retraining for the entire gate security detail. And she's making it clear this isn't just about Whitmore and Jensen. This is about systemic failure, about a culture that allowed this to happen. And Marcus appreciates that. He does. But he's also thinking about the 100 small indignities that never make it to an admiral's attention. The black enlisted personnel who get extra scrutiny at this same gate. The assumptions and microaggressions that compound over time like interest on a debt no one agreed to take on. The crowd of onlookers is dispersing now, some reluctantly. They wanted to see what happens next. Others quickly. Embarrassed to have been part of the audience to someone's degradation. And Marcus notices a young black sailor in the crowd, maybe 19, watching everything with wide eyes. And Marcus makes eye contact with him, holds it for a moment, and he can see the kid processing it all, seeing that even a lieutenant commander can be reduced to a suspect at the gate. And Marcus wonders what lesson that kid is learning right now, what that does to his sense of belonging in this uniform. But then something unexpected happens. The young sailor steps forward, comes to attention, and salutes Marcus. Holds it, even though protocol doesn't require it for officers in civilian clothes. And Marcus returns the salute, and there's something in that exchange. Something about resilience and recognition. About one generation telling the next. I see you, I've been you, and we're still here. And it's a small moment, but it matters. Maybe more than the Admiral's investigation or the guard's suspension. Because it's a reminder that this isn't just about Marcus. It's about everyone who's worn this uniform while wearing brown skin. Everyone who's had to prove themselves twice as hard for half the recognition. Admiral Morrison escorts Marcus personally to the administration building. Her own vehicle, her own driver, and she's talking about implementing new training protocols, about bringing in diversity consultants, about making this a teaching moment for the entire base. And Marcus nods along, but he's thinking about whether real change comes from training sessions or whether it requires something deeper, something that can't be taught in a seminar, like genuine belief that people of color belong in positions of authority, that excellence doesn't have a color, that an officer is an officer regardless of the skin they're in. When they arrive at the admin building, there's already a buzz. Word has spread like wildfire the way military gossip does, and Marcus can see people looking at him differently. Some with respect, some with pity he doesn't want. Some with curiosity, like he's a phenomenon to be studied rather than a person, and he straightens his shoulders and walks in like he owns the place. Because in a few hours, officially, he sort of will. The formal introduction ceremony is scheduled for 1400 hours. That's 2 p.m. for civilians watching this. And normally it would be a routine affair, some speeches, a transfer of authority, handshakes and photos. But now it's charged with tension. Everyone on base knows what happened this morning. And the auditorium is packed, standing room only. People want to see how Marcus handles this. Whether he'll address it, whether he'll let it slide, whether he'll be the bigger person or demand accountability. And Marcus is backstage in his dress whites, the same uniform Whitmore accused him of stealing. And he's adjusting his cover in the mirror, looking at himself, at the ribbons on his chest that tell a story of service and sacrifice. And he's deciding what kind of deputy commander he's going to be, whether this morning's incident becomes a footnote or a foundation. Admiral Morrison introduces him with full honors, reciting his service record, his deployments, his commendations, a Navy Achievement Medal, 2 Navy Commendation Medals, a Meritorious Service Medal, and as she lists them, Marcus watches the audience, sees Whitmore and Jensen sitting in the back row in civilian clothes, required to attend even though they've been suspended, and he sees the young black sailor from this morning in the 3rd row. Sitting up straight, and he sees dozens of other faces, white, black, Asian, Hispanic, all in uniform. All theoretically equal under the code of military justice, but he knows better. He knows the reality is more complicated than the ideal. When Marcus takes the podium, the applause is thunderous, longer than typical ceremony applause, and he knows it's partly sympathy, partly people performing their support, but he'll take it. He nods his thanks and waits for silence. And then he does something unexpected. He sets aside his prepared remarks, the safe speech about honor and duty and continuing the base's proud tradition, and he speaks from the heart, saying, "This morning I was stopped at the gate of this installation, detained, searched, and questioned despite presenting valid military identification, and I want to talk about that because if we can't be honest about our failures, we can't hope to fix them." And you can feel the room tense up. This isn't standard ceremony talk. This is real. And some people shift uncomfortably because confronting racism makes people uncomfortable. Especially when it's undeniable. Marcus continues, his voice steady but passionate. "I don't believe those guards woke up this morning wanting to discriminate. I don't think they're uniquely evil or malicious. But I do believe they had assumptions buried so deep they didn't even recognize them as assumptions. They saw a black man in a modest car and their brains filled in a story that had nothing to do with reality. And here's what's important. That's not just their failing. It's our failing as an institution if we've created an environment where those assumptions go unchallenged, where the idea of a black senior officer is so unexpected that it triggers suspicion rather than respect. And people are really listening now. Some nodding, some stone-faced, and Marcus can see Admiral Morrison in the front row, her expression unreadable, but her attention absolute. But Marcus isn't done. He pivots, saying, "However, I also saw something else this morning. I saw a colonel who immediately corrected the situation. I saw an admiral who didn't make excuses or minimize what happened. I saw a young sailor who understood the moment and stood in solidarity. And that tells me we have the capacity for better. We have people who get it, who understand that our strength comes from our diversity, that we're better when we actually live up to our values rather than just talking about them." And the mood shifts slightly, people breathing a little easier because he's offering a path forward. Not just condemnation, and that's leadership. That's knowing when to confront and when to inspire, when to call out, and when to call up. Marcus looks directly at Whitmore and Jensen in the back row. Doesn't name them, but the eye contact is unmistakable. And he says to those who made mistakes today, "You have a choice now. You can be defensive and resentful, or you can be reflective and committed to growth. You can see this as the end of your story or the beginning of a better chapter. And I genuinely hope you choose the latter because we need people who can admit when they're wrong and do the work to be better." And there's something almost gracious in that, giving them an out, a redemption arc, even though he'd be justified in demanding their heads on a platter. The ceremony concludes with Marcus officially assuming his duties, and afterward there's a reception, coffee and cookies in the base community center. And Marcus is immediately surrounded by well-wishers, senior officers saying the right things, enlisted personnel thanking him for his words. And it's all very nice but also exhausting, because performing grace in the face of indignity is its own kind of labor. Emotional labor that doesn't show up in any job description. Then something remarkable happens. Whitmore approaches Marcus, clearly terrified, hands shaking slightly, and he says, "Sir, I owe you an apology. What I did this morning was wrong. I let my assumptions control my actions, and I'm ashamed." And Marcus studies him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch just enough to be uncomfortable, because easy forgiveness can sometimes minimize the harm. But then he says, "I appreciate you saying that, Petty Officer Whitmore, and I hope you mean it. Because words are easy, change is hard. I need to see you doing the work, challenging yourself and others, being the kind of leader who makes space for people who don't look like you." And Whitmore nods vigorously. "Yes, sir, I will, sir." And Marcus thinks maybe he will. Maybe this incident will actually transform someone, or maybe it won't. Maybe Whitmore will just learn to hide his prejudice better, to be more careful about when and how he acts on his assumptions. And there's no way to know yet, only time will tell. Jensen doesn't approach, stays on the periphery looking miserable, and Marcus makes note of that. The difference. Between someone who apologizes and someone who just feels sorry for themselves, And he knows that not everyone has the capacity for real self-examination. Some people will always be the victim in their own story. But he also knows he can't fix everyone, can't carry the burden of everyone's growth. He has a base to help run and his own integrity to maintain. Admiral Morrison pulls Marcus aside, away from the crowd, and she says quietly, "That was a hell of a speech, not what I expected." But exactly what was needed, and Marcus responds, "Permission to speak freely, ma'am?" And she nods, and he says, "We can do all the investigations and training we want. But if leadership doesn't model inclusive behavior, if we don't actively promote and protect minority service members, nothing changes. Policies are only as good as the people implementing them." And Morrison smiles slightly. "That's why you're here, Marcus. That's why I personally recommended you for this position. We need people who won't let us off easy, who will push us to be better." And Marcus feels a flicker of hope. Maybe this assignment will be different. Maybe he can actually move the needle. 3 weeks pass, and Marcus settles into his role as deputy base commander. And the gate incident becomes one of those stories people tell, some versions sympathetic, some skeptical, because there are always people who want to believe these things are overblown, who need to downplay racism to protect their worldview. But Marcus doesn't have time to worry about those people. He's too busy implementing changes, real structural changes, not just diversity theater, but actual reform. He establishes a direct reporting system for discrimination complaints that bypasses normal chain of command, because sometimes the chain of command is part of the problem. He institutes monthly roundtables with junior enlisted personnel, creating space for honest conversations about climate and culture, and he personally reviews every security incident at the gates, looking for patterns, looking for evidence of selective enforcement, and he finds some. Nothing as blatant as his own experience, but plenty of smaller indignities. Black and brown service members getting extra scrutiny, more frequent vehicle searches, longer delays, and he addresses each one. Not with punishment, but with conversation, with training, with transparency. Whitmore, true to his word, actually seems to be trying. He volunteers for the diversity committee, attends every training session, and Marcus hears through the grapevine that he's been challenging other guards when they make assumptions. And that's good. That's growth. But Marcus also knows that one person's growth doesn't erase systemic issues, doesn't guarantee the next black officer won't face the same suspicion at the same gate. Because racism isn't just individual prejudice. It's accumulated history. It's institutional inertia. It's 1,000 small decisions and assumptions that compound over time into patterns that feel inevitable but are actually chosen, again and again by people who have the power to choose differently. Jensen, on the other hand, takes early retirement, and Marcus learns he's been telling people he was forced out for doing his job, playing the victim, claiming reverse racism, and Marcus sighs when he hears this because, of course, there are people who will twist accountability into oppression, who will see consequences for their actions as persecution. But he also knows that's part of the process. Change is never clean, never unanimous. There will always be resistance from those who benefited from the old system, who mistake equality for oppression because they're so used to unearned advantage it feels like a right. The young black sailor from the gate incident. His name is Jameson. He becomes something of a mentee to Marcus, stops by his office periodically for advice, and during one visit he asks, "Sir, does it ever stop bothering you? The assumptions, the extra scrutiny, does it get easier?" And Marcus considers lying, offering false comfort. But instead he says, "It doesn't stop. And it doesn't get easier, but you get stronger. You build a thicker skin not because you should have to, but because you have to. And you find community, people who see you fully, who don't make you prove your humanity before they offer respect. And those people make it bearable." And Jameson nods slowly, processing this, and Marcus adds, "But here's the thing. You also get to a point where you refuse to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. You take up space, you demand the respect you've earned, not with arrogance, but with quiet certainty. Because you know your worth even when others don't, and that's power. That's the kind of power they can't take from you." And he watches understanding bloom in Jameson's face, watches this young man straighten up a little taller. And Marcus thinks maybe that's the real work, not changing the minds of every Whitmore or Jensen, but empowering the next generation to walk through the world with their heads high. 6 months into his tenure, Admiral Morrison announces her retirement, and there's immediate speculation about who will replace her as base commander. And Marcus's name comes up, floated by junior officers and enlisted personnel who've seen his leadership, his fairness, his willingness to address hard truths. But the Navy brass ultimately selects a white male rear admiral from another installation, someone with slightly more time in grade, and it's not necessarily wrong or unfair by the metrics the Navy uses. But it's also a reminder that progress is slow, that for every Marcus Hayes who breaks through, there are 10 positions still filled by people who look like they've always looked. And Marcus handles it with grace publicly, congratulates the incoming commander, offers his full support, but privately, alone in his office late at night. He allows himself to feel the disappointment, the weariness of always having to be twice as good for half the credit, the exhaustion of being both pioneer and proof of concept, symbol and human being, and he thinks about retiring, about taking his pension and spending more time with his daughter who's about to start high school. But then he remembers Jameson and dozens of other young service members who need to see themselves reflected in leadership, who need to know it's possible, and he decides to stay, at least for now, at least until he can pass the torch to someone else who'll carry it forward. The gate incident, which could have broken Marcus or made him bitter, instead becomes a catalyst, not just for policy changes on his base, but for conversations across the entire military community. Other installations reach out asking for his insights on improving their own gate security protocols, their diversity initiatives, their climate assessments, and Marcus becomes something of an accidental activist, traveling to different bases, sharing his story, listening to others' stories, and he realizes this is his purpose now. Not just command, but transformation. Not just leading, but mentoring a generation of leaders who will do it better, who will create environments where the next black officer doesn't have to wonder if they belong, doesn't have to carry extra documentation or prepare for humiliation, can just show up and serve with the same assumption of competence afforded to their white peers. The story could end there, with Marcus as the triumphant figure who turned prejudice into progress. But that would be too simple, too clean. Because the reality is more complex, he still faces subtle discrimination, still gets mistaken for a lower rank by visiting personnel, still has to prove himself in rooms where his white counterpart's authority is assumed, but he also has victories, small and large. He sees the gate security detail become genuinely more professional and equitable. He sees more minority officers selected for leadership positions. He sees the base climate survey numbers improve year over year, and those things matter. They don't erase the injustice he experienced, but they give it meaning. They turn a moment of humiliation into a movement of accountability. And isn't that the work? Not waiting for perfect justice, but fighting for incremental progress. Celebrating the victories while acknowledging how far there still is to go. 2 years after the gate incident, Whitmore applies to officer candidate school, and he lists Marcus as a reference. And Marcus is surprised, but also moved. He writes a recommendation that's honest, noting Whitmore's past mistakes, but also his genuine growth, his commitment to becoming better. And Whitmore gets accepted, becomes an ensign, and years later, when he's a lieutenant junior grade running his own division, he institutes policies protecting his sailors from the kind of assumptions he once made. And he tells the story of that November morning at the gate, not as the victim, but as the perpetrator, as a cautionary tale about how good people can do harm when they don't examine their biases. And in that way, Marcus's experience multiplies, ripples out through Whitmore's leadership and touches sailors Marcus will never meet. And maybe that's the real resolution, not a single moment of justice, but 1,000 small corrections, a gradual bending of the arc toward something better. And Marcus's daughter, she's in college now studying political science, and she wants to write her senior thesis about racism in the military using her father's experience as a case study. And Marcus feels conflicted about it, doesn't want his pain to be her research material. But she insists, says, "Dad, your story matters. It's not just about what happened to you, it's about systems and structures, about how even progressive institutions perpetuate inequality, and I need to study that, to understand it so I can help change it," and he realizes she's already carrying the torch, already committed to the work in her own way, and he gives her permission. Sits for long interviews where she asks hard questions about how discrimination affected his mental health, His career trajectory, his sense of self, and answering those questions is difficult. Requires a vulnerability he's not used to showing. But it's also healing. Naming the wounds helps them scar properly. And when she presents her thesis, he's in the audience. And he hears his experience contextualized within larger patterns of institutional racism. Hears his pain transformed into analysis. And he feels pride, not just in her scholarship, but in her commitment to truth-telling, to refusing easy answers or comfortable narratives. And he thinks maybe this is the legacy. Not just the policy changes he implemented on one base, but the consciousness he helped awaken in his daughter and others like her. The next generation who won't accept injustice as inevitable, who'll demand better and build better. So what's the moral here? What are we supposed to take from Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes and his humiliating morning at a military gate? Is it simply that racism exists even in places like the military where merit is supposed to matter most? Or is it something more nuanced? Something about resilience and agency, about the choice to let injustice destroy you or transform you, to become bitter or become better, to focus on what you can't control or what you can? And maybe the answer is all of those things. Maybe there's no single moral, but rather a constellation of truths. That racism is real and pervasive, that individuals can grow and change, that systems require constant vigilance and correction, that leadership matters, that representation matters, that our experiences of injustice can become fuel for transformation if we choose to use them that way. And that's not a happy ending exactly. It's not Marcus riding off into the sunset having solved racism. But it's a hopeful ending, a realistic ending. An ending that acknowledges both the persistence of injustice and the possibility of progress. Both the weight of history and the agency of individuals committed to bending that arc just a little bit more toward justice. If you've made it this far in the story, thank you for watching. Thank you for bearing witness to Marcus's experience and the experiences of countless real service members who've faced similar indignities. And before you go, I want you to do something. I want you to examine your own assumptions. We all have them, about who looks like a leader, who looks like they belong in certain spaces, who deserves the benefit of the doubt, and who has to prove themselves. And those assumptions, unless we actively interrogate them, shape our actions in ways we don't even realize. They make us the guard at the gate, questioning valid credentials. They make us the bystander who assumes someone must have done something wrong. And we can do better. We have to do better. Because every Marcus Hayes deserves to drive through that gate without proving he belongs there. And every Jameson deserves to serve without wondering if his skin color will always be seen before his service. And that starts with us, with you, with me. With all of us choosing to see people fully, to grant dignity freely, to offer respect not because someone has earned it by jumping through extra hoops, but because it's the baseline human right. This is Axiom USA, where we tell stories that matter, stories that challenge us to think deeper and do better. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel or question something, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel because we're just getting started. We've got more stories about resilience and injustice and the complicated reality of living while Black in America. Stories that don't offer easy answers, but do offer honest reflections. And that's what we need, not comfort, but truth. Not platitudes, but real conversation about real issues. So join us, be part of this community, and let's keep pushing for a world where Marcus's story becomes impossible, because we've finally dismantled the assumptions that made it possible in the first place. Until next time, stay conscious, stay committed, and remember that change starts with seeing, really seeing each other.